I have just accepted Her Majesty the Queen's kind invitation to form a new government.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's fantastic to be back.
In this new era, we're taking a new approach.
It will be uncensorable and uncancelable.
We can't give in to those who say we can't do better.
That is a disgrace.
We can make the West great again.
The status quo is not an option.
Welcome to the Liz Truss Show. 3 years ago, in 2022, Britain was in a dire state. The economy was stagnant, immigration was rampant, and the so-called Conservative government was steeped in wokery. Boris Johnson had been hounded out of his job as Prime Minister, for which he'd secured a stonking majority in 2019, by Conservatives in name only in the party like Michael Gove, who had allied with Greta Thunberg to impose net zero targets on Britain, pushed for tougher COVID lockdowns, and backed Kamala Harris to be President of the United States. They had wanted to install Rishi Sunak as leader, a believer in the status quo. Sunak, as Chancellor, had already put up taxes to the highest level in 70 years, including a new health and social care tax. He'd raised corporation tax from 19 to 25%, imposed a windfall tax on the oil and gas industry, and spent £400 billion during COVID. Sunak and his acolytes were in league with the British economic institutions, like the Bank of England, the Treasury, and the Office of Budget Responsibility. These institutions, given power by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, had been captured by leftist Keynesian ideology, who wanted to sell Britain out to the EU and China. They believed in net zero and DEI. They probably thought the Laffer curve was a comedy club in Sheffield. In short, they wanted to continue to manage Britain's decline. I couldn't resist the urge to take on these people. I knew it was a David versus Goliath battle. I called them out during the leadership campaign. I promised to take on the economic establishment who was selling out our country. And I won, thanks to the patriots in the Conservative Party, knowing deep down I was right. I was elected leader of the party and Prime Minister on the 4th of September. Within 4 days of my being elected, Her Majesty the Queen died after 70 years on the throne. Beloved across our country, this was a huge blow to the nation. I felt the weight of responsibility and sought as I could to live up to the promises I'd made. We immediately drafted up the mini-budget, reversing all of the disastrous decisions, restoring corporation tax to 19%, legalising fracking, restraining the burgeoning welfare bill. Little did I know that whilst I was doing the right thing, my enemies were continuing to plot. The Bank of England was sitting on a scandal of their own making. They'd failed to regulate pension funds properly, leading them to be heavily leveraged and dependent on interest rates being low forever. And after printing huge amounts of money, unleashing inflation and debasing the pound, they suddenly decided to start a quantitative tightening program, unbeknownst to me. So the day before we launched our mini-budget, the Bank of England announced the sale of £40 billion of gilts, queering the pitch and starting a chain reaction that led to the pension funds having to make cash calls and market panic. The actions of the Bank of England led to a rise in mortgage rates, meaning households in Britain were panicked about what they would have to pay. At the time, the Bank of England blamed me for all of this. As they hadn't told me what they were doing, I was blindsided, and therefore wasn't able to respond in kind. The Treasury and the OBR leaked information to the press, claiming my plans were unfunded tax cuts, echoing the George Bush criticism of voodoo economics. My enemies in the Tory party and the leftist mainstream media were only too happy to blame me, chase me down, and run briefings non-stop. This created a feeding frenzy. I was isolated at number 10. In the current British system, all of the senior people are career bureaucrats. These officials put a proverbial gun to my head, forcing me to reverse the policies on pain of them creating a debt crisis. The Conservative Parliamentary Party then finished the job, getting rid of me after 49 days. Of course, when the coast was clear in 2024, the Bank of England put out a report admitting their LDI failings alone had caused 2/3 of the crisis. That's not including their QT or their failure to raise interest rates as much as the Fed. They have since changed this report on the website, but I still have a copy. There has been very little coverage of the true facts in the mainstream media or by the political class. The miscreants at the Bank of England and the Office for Budget Responsibility got away scot-free. Yet again, the media preferred to lie to the public about what happened, rather than face the truth about the shocking institutional failure that took place. Britain is run by a cabal of technocrats, determined to run the country down whilst feathering their own nests. They work hand in hand with establishment politicians, corporatists and the media. Until their lock on power is broken, this country is in a downward spiral. Today I talked to the Right Honourable Jacob Rees-Mogg, who served in my cabinet and was there at the time, and Andrew Lilico, a leading economist at Europe Economics, about the coup in 2022. It's great to be joined by Andrew Lilico of Europe Economics. Andrew, thanks very much for coming on the Liz Truss show. We're talking about what happened in 2022. Would you just give a brief outline from your perspective as somebody who has studied the events of that year and what actually happened?
Well, through that year, of course, there were quite rapid rises in interest rates because the inflation had gone quite high. It got to over 10% at one stage late in the year, and interest rates have been rising rapidly. As the interest rates rose, that exposed a problem that had existed in pension markets for some time. What had happened in pension markets was that people had entered into particular sorts of derivatives contracts and fancy financial dealings, which were supposed to not be allowed of pension funds, but they'd done it with these special purpose vehicles, kind of arm's length arrangements. And one of the consequences of that was that when there was some volatility in gilts prices associated with a number of different factors, perhaps we'll discuss them in more detail later, but that then triggered a problem with these particular pension funds, and that then led to an escalating, a kind of self-feeding cycle in gilts, which raised the gilts prices up in quite a material spike, which they then fell back. But by the time they had fallen back, there had been some political developments associated with yourself, and so people then closely associated those events with, in particular, the mini budget, which I think is largely a misallocation of what the actual causation was.
So you were talking about the pension funds and the LDIs, the liability driven investments that they'd invested in. Why was Britain particularly exposed to this? Because 60% of all of the world's LDIs were held by the UK.
So we have a material part of defined benefit pension schemes, and a large portion of those, something like 60% of those, were heavily involved in this area. And the regulator had placed certain kinds of restrictions on those firms, which were other people would have restricted them as well. But the restrictions which they placed were limited in nature. So they prevented the firms themselves from being involved in various kinds of fancy financial dealings, but they allowed the firms to set up special purpose vehicles that engaged in these fancy dealings. And one problem with doing things that way, it actually makes things worse than if you just let the pension funds do it themselves. Because one of the consequences of things being arm's length is that if the arm's length entity has to then add any extra capital, provide some extra capital in the event that financial market movements go against it. It's not a matter of just the firm itself can decide to inject the extra capital. The firm then has to make some agreement, has to go through its own processes to agree to inject capital into an arm's length firm. And things get even worse if you have lots of firms together in the same arm's length special purpose vehicle, which is one of the things that happened in the UK, particularly with smaller pension funds. So then you have to get lots and lots of ducks in a row of agreeing to post things over there. And the whole process gets very cumbersome and slow. One of the consequences of that, in turn, is because it's so slow, if you have to do things in a hurry, then once you've actually got through all of these things and agreed that, you don't want a further extra step of waiting for a while to liquidate whatever form of collateral you're going to post. So, and the only thing that you can do at that point, because things are very slow, to get the money fast enough, is to sell gilts. So if you have a problem that makes you need to post collateral which comes from gilts, and the only response you can do to that is to sell gilts, then you're going to have this kind of self-feeding cycle I described before.
Do the products that these pension funds invested in any way resemble the type of products that emerged during the financial crisis? The derivatives, is it a similar kind of issue?
I wouldn't say it's really like that. No, I mean in spirit, in the sense of being derivatives, yes, but I don't think it's really the same kind of a question. Because one of the issues with those products, the ones during the financial crisis, were that they kind of parceled up the different elements of risk in the product, and they then created derivatives out of pieces of these very complex and parceled things. And that had its upsides and its downsides, but it's a different process from what's going on here. What happens in the one of the things to bear in mind in the financial crisis is that fundamentally there's a solvency problem. So these entities get into trouble because the derivatives themselves go bust. In the case of the liability-driven investments, it's not really that the financial instrument has gone that bad. It hasn't gone bust. It's simply that it needs some extra collateral to support it. So it's a liquidity problem rather than a solvency problem. And that's also one of the reasons why, whereas when you had the issues with the financial crisis, they become very persistent and things go on for more than a decade of some of the consequences of those things. In the case of the movements in liability-driven investments in 2022, it was quite easily resolved by the Bank of England providing enough liquidity once it felt it had to do that. And there weren't really any lasting consequences. You can see in the kind of financial market metrics, nothing really, it's a short-term spike. It all goes away. It should be in history like one of many little blips that there were in financial markets, which people don't really discuss very much. The only reason it gets discussed a lot was because it happened to align in time and have some quite significant political consequences.
So who was responsible for regulating those pension funds and allowing them to get in a position where they were essentially betting on interest rates being low forever? Because that was the bet they'd made.
Well, it's a combination of different entities in the UK. There's the pensions regulators and the Bank of England. It's basically those entities, some participation of the Financial Conduct Authority, but it's the various financial regulators that are the ones that are responsible for that.
I mean, it's one of the problems that it's not clear who is responsible. If you're saying it's the pension regulator or it's the Bank of England.
Well, yes and no. You can criticise the actual regulation here, and they did have some investigations. My criticism is less, actually, I think my criticism would be a bit less of the, as it were, strategic response. I think there was some issue of creating an environment in which you forbade these entities from doing things, but then permitting them to do arm's length things. I think that's kind of one sort of problem. But the more significant problem you might think is, well, why didn't they spot that these entities were so exposed? Because a number of people had complained for many years, quite a few years going back about 8-9 years, that these entities had these problems, that they were exposed in this way. And there were investigations by these authorities, and they did them in 2018 and 2019. One of the things you see about those dates, of course, is that they come just before COVID. So what happens is they investigate these matters when we're still in the world of very, very low interest rates and people talking about lower for longer and maybe the rates are going to go even longer again. And you could see all kinds of analyses at the time based on an assumption that the world had changed and things were going to be in this stagnant state forever. COVID then breaks us out of that whole process in good ways and bad, and we end up in a higher interest rate world by 2022. And I think it's a bit difficult for the authorities in 2019 really to have anticipated that. The thing I would criticise them for is once we get into 2022 and we have this rapid interest rate spike, it should already have been on their radar. They'd looked at these things in detail in 2019. They knew in principle what some of the nature of the threats were. They'd assessed at the time that these were remote threats, and that's fine. It was a mistake, but I can understand why. But having done that, once it gets to 2022, and then you have the rapid interest rate rises, they should have known that it was just a ticking time bomb.
Who would they?
Oh, the Bank of England in particular, probably, and the pensions regulator.
What about the Treasury?
I mean, the Treasury, I would have thought that this was the kind of thing that the Bank of England should have been alerting the Treasury to.
Because don't you think it's extraordinary when we were working on the mini budget, this literally wasn't mentioned. It wasn't mentioned that there was a fragile situation. It wasn't mentioned that we had all these funds that were exposed if interest rates were to rise.
I think one of the reasons why would probably be because the scale of things done in the mini budget that were actually announced in the mini budget itself just wasn't nearly large enough to have a material impact on these kinds of events. What we're talking about here is the actual new elements announced in the mini budget are only around £1 to £5 billion in scale. It's tiny impacts. And sure, a budget, any kind of fiscal event could be associated with a few tens of basis points movements in gilts either way. And that should be the kind of thing which, okay, you get a few headlines and some people make some money and some people lose some money, but it's not going to be the kind of thing which is going to stimulate any financial crisis. It just wasn't. The mini budget wasn't that big a deal in terms of there have been much more significant budgets through history that should have had much wider implications. There have been ones that caused bigger movements on the day than the mini budget. So I would have thought one of the reasons might have been, if people had thought that the mini budget might be moving markets enough, maybe they would have asked more questions along these lines, but it just didn't seem plausible.
But at the time, the Treasury officials didn't believe it would.
No.
That's what we
I think they're wrong.
Well, that's what we were being told. So what did trigger the crisis then?
The LDR crisis was a crisis waiting to happen, and it was one of a number of financial crises, kind of financial nasties. There's a saying in financial markets that goes back, which is that when the tide goes out, you find out who's not wearing any bathing costume. All right, there's a number of things in financial markets that if you're in a rapid growth environment like pre-2007, then people do certain kinds of things assuming that's going to continue, and if that changes, they get exposed. If you're in a very low interest rate environment and then the interest rates suddenly rise, then the strategies that seem to make sense in that environment suddenly get exposed. And it's not only in the UK. You get analogous problems arise in the US with some of the Silicon Valley Bank problems, and they're again associated with bonds markets. There you get problems with Credit Suisse in Switzerland. So in a number of countries, within a few months, you get similar kinds of financial crises, which are all really the consequence of this normalization process, exposing strategies which weren't viable. And so the way I think of this is, suppose I've got a balloon and I've got it inflated out so that it's now getting very weak and it's going to get bigger and bigger. And then it's so weak that the heat of the sun alone causes the balloon to burst. You could say it's the heat of the sun that caused it, but the sun's only really the trigger. It's not the cause. The balloon's always going to burst. And that LDI crisis was always going to happen at some point. Now, exactly what triggered it? I mean, there are all kinds of things. It might be that it was that the mini budget could have caused, a few tens of basis points, and maybe things were so fragile at that point that it was actually enough. There's also a number of other things going on. The Bank of England has an interest rate announcement where it doesn't do what financial markets expect at the time. So that could have been a cause. That's the day before the mini budget. There's big movements in the US dollar at that time, which had nothing to do with the pound. It's just the US dollar story. And so that's causing some international volatility. You actually see volatility in quite a number of markets. The UK is bigger because its volatility then triggers this bigger crisis, but there's volatility in many countries, and it's hard to imagine that announcing the 45p rate going has really caused a large amount of volatility in the US and in the Eurozone.
Quite, and of course, the night before the mini budget, the Bank of England announced the start of the QT programme, selling £40 billion worth of gilts.
Indeed, it did, and that's again another factor. That's causing some tightening in the gilts market. That's liable to lead to a rise in gilts prices. A rise in gilts yields, a fall in gilts prices, and so that's another possibility as a contributor. And of course, one of the things that the bank does when it's calming markets is reverse that for a short period. It provides enough. Once it provides a liquidity backstop in these markets, the issue goes away quite fast. Now, you can say that maybe they should have done that quicker. I mean, I have some sympathy with the bank in terms of the strategy there, in that they do, when they're going to engage in these interventions, sometimes like financial markets to sweat a bit. They don't want everybody to feel like they're just going to backstop all of your mistakes. So they want to leave things, they want to leave people to sweat a bit, and then maybe they come in. A thing I think that they should have been clearer about, though, was that what this was all about was these pension funds. It wasn't that the pension funds were suffering as a consequence of the mini budget. It was that markets were suffering as a consequence of the pension funds.
But didn't they effectively try to blame what we were doing for the mistakes they had caused?
That's one way of painting it. I mean, I think, and there's a natural human element that if things are, if you're feeling like somebody's going to blame you for saying, well, why didn't you regulate the market, the pensions better, or why didn't you spot these earlier, then you want to say, look over there at the mini budget. So I think that is a thing I think I would criticize them for, was the narrative element. I don't really criticize them for not spotting it in 2019. I think they probably should have spotted things earlier in 2022, but no, you make mistakes. I don't really criticize them for waiting a little bit to allow the volatility before they intervene, but I do think it's wrong that they weren't clearer at the time that it was the pension issue that was causing the volatility. It wasn't the mini budget that was causing the pension issue.
And in fact, they released a report in 2024 saying that.
Indeed,
they released it in a very quiet way.
Well, it's a technical report with a few equations here and there, and who knows how many people might have been interested in reading it other than you or me. But yes, so they suggested there that of what they identified as a little bit more than 100 points spike, roughly corresponding to the difference between everybody else's volatility in the UK's, they say some 2/3 is to do with these liability-driven investment products. So their estimate is that most of it is to do with that. And of course, everyone now calls it, the IMF and everyone else calls it the liability-driven investments crisis. Nobody in serious economic analysis calls it the mini budget caused crisis.
But everybody in the British media calls it that. So you still have the narrative being peddled by Keir Starmer, being peddled by even people in the Conservative Party and the British mainstream media, that the market crisis in 2022 was a Liz Truss crisis or a mini budget crisis. What has gone so wrong that these journalists, these politicians, don't want to tell the truth about what happened?
I mean, I guess the journalists respond to they're telling political stories as much as anything, but I think one of the things is fairly clearly that it was in the interests of people on all sides of politics to blame you. So you were done in not only by Labour people, but by the Conservatives who were your enemies.
It was in the interests of people who had lost to me in the leadership election and wanted to get Rishi Sunak in to do that. But is it really in the interest of the Conservative Party for me to be falsely blamed for a crisis created by the Bank of England? I mean, I would say not, because the Conservatives ended up getting the worst results since 1834. They're now at 15% in the polls. It hasn't worked out that well for them.
Well, I would say not as well. But of course, if they'd been the kind of party that did smart things, then they would have ended up with 120 seats.
I think one of the problems that we now have in British politics and economics is nobody is really telling the truth about why we're in the long-term crisis we're in. And I would trace it right back to the 1990s. We've become a highly regulated country. Our energy costs are some of the highest in the world. We've got taxes are at a historic high. The government's spending 45% of GDP. These are the causes of why Britain's economy has been stagnant. But you've got politicians who want to say it's my fault or it's Brexit or wherever else. And we don't seem to have, in most of the media, a serious discussion or analysis about why we're in this massive hole. And I think this is just one example of like a complete denial of reality by the British economic establishment.
I definitely think it's true that people like fairly simple sort of stories, and they like something recent to point at, particularly things that they don't like, as it were, to point at.
So we don't have a institutional structure in Britain that is actually capable of seeing what's wrong. And what we've got now is a public who are very disillusioned with the entire political media class. It's one of the reasons I've set up my new show, is to actually talk about what is really going on. And I don't believe that until you make the Bank of England accountable again, you are actually going to get it properly run. I think it's fundamental to its structure. I think the way it was made independent, the governor is not sackable for 8 years now, unless he commits gross negligence. It's an extraordinarily high bar compared to the Prime Minister, which, as I discovered, is pretty easily sackable. So we've got this massive imbalance, and you can see, even the current government, who are lovers of the technocratic bureaucracy, tiptoe around the OBR and the Bank of England because they're scared of them. And that should not be the case in a democracy. It's gone fundamentally off the rails.
So I agree with a lot of that. I think politicians like to lay off onto technocrats decisions because they don't want to be exposed to them properly. So, Rachel Reeves doesn't want to say, I've decided to raise taxes because I want to fund some extra spending, and that's just what I want to do. She wants to say, I have to raise taxes because the beastly OBR has said that there's this whatever black hole. And she feels so obliged to say that she even says that when it's not true, when there's not actually any black hole. So it's like they don't want to take any responsibility for decisions. And I actually think that your premiership is an illustration of why. That the process, some combination of the kind of people that are involved in politics, so that politics is kind of a career for them instead of them having some ideological or actual goal thing that they want to do for being in politics. It's just, this is my team, and this is the group that I happen to be with. They respond. What they think is most important is that they're in charge or they get re-elected. It doesn't matter about doing anything. It's just that it's us. And they then think that they then look at these continuous opinion polls and stuff said on social media and things like that. And it's very difficult for politicians for those who want to make any kind of decision, to achieve vindication. So even if you did have something you wanted to do, you introduce your policy. You think of the 1980s. Your classic kind of Thatcher thing was that you introduce some policies early in your term. Everybody hates them. By year 4, they're all starting to work. So then all the people who criticize them earlier look like idiots, and then you march home with a massive majority. That's the way that kind of vindication strategy is supposed to work in politics. But if you don't really believe anything works because you don't believe in anything, then you're going to struggle to believe that yourself. But B, even if you thought that, if I think that what's going to actually happen is I'm going to introduce this policy early on, all my own MPs are going to panic and fire me, and then so I'm never going to get as far as the vindication. And I feel like your case is an illustration of that, which has actually made these things more difficult for politicians. They feel like they can't. It's almost as if things are too democratically sensitive, and they feel the answer to that must be then to put them outside democratic processes altogether. And I just think that's the wrong answer.
But this is the consequence of, or what I saw when I was at Number 10, and I think you describe it quite accurately as what's happened when all these powers have been handed over to the technocracy, and the difficulty of actually pursuing the policy you think is right for the country, which is exactly what I wanted to do. I think it points to the fact that you need a much bigger change in our institutions. So the current system simply doesn't deliver. you get the wrong kind of politicians, you get technocrats who are not actually prepared to shoulder responsibility, and the country is in perpetual decline. So I think what my premiership illustrated in the way it ended is the need for massive change in Britain. Otherwise, where does this road end?
Yeah, I think that's right, but I think it's important to recognise that part of that has to be a change in our parties, because I find it so think about what happens in the Conservative Party after you. So you then have, they know that with absolute certainty that they're going to lose the next general election. Right? All the opinion polls show they're being way behind, but they're sitting there with an 80 majority, 2 years. So suddenly you're like, they should have been like the kids in the candy shop, because now they can do absolutely anything they ever dreamed of with no consequence. Because often all those things that people said, you can't introduce that policy because it'll cost you the next general election. It's not going to cost me anything because I'm going to lose the next general election anyway. And then it turns out that the Conservative Party, through some combination of not really wanting to do anything and being so enormously split, that the summit of its ambition was to introduce a football regulator and ban smoking or something. I can't really believe that this is what MPs spend all those decades advancing in politics to want to do. So I feel like one of the things that we really need is politicians who believe in things and who are willing to lose to do those things, and then lose if the public doesn't want them. So people who have more to their life than just being politicians. And the parties need to pick those people who aren't just, and that's not always necessarily a matter of not being a career politician. Career politicians could well be, have some of them could quite properly be prepared to sacrifice their careers for convictions. That's not intrinsic, but you need the right balance of people. So people who just say things and don't really believe they'll work, that's what, and there's so many people in politics today, I think, who say the thing which they think people want to hear, but they don't actually deep down believe that if they do that, it'll work. And that's part of the reason that they're terrified, that they panic and fire their bosses and so on so quickly, is because they don't believe in vindication, because they don't believe these things will work and then get them the political reward.
There's a lot of work to be done. Thank you very much, Andrew, for coming on the show. Going to talk to you. I'm delighted today to be joined by Jacob Rees-Mogg, a former cabinet colleague of mine, formerly in my cabinet, and now a fantastic voice for freedom. So, Jacob, let's just talk about where Britain is today in 2025 and how things might have been different had the policies of our administration been implemented.
Well, the country's in a terrible state. The really simple thing is that we're spending too much and we are earning too little. And so taxation is as high as it's ever been. It's about 38% of GDP. Taxation in the UK never gets above 38% of GDP, and expenditure is at 45%. So you've got a 7% gap, which is about £200 billion a year. And there's a little bit of fees and there's a little bit of asset sales, but basically there's a £200 billion gap. And the government has no idea of how to fill that. And its tax raises are slowing the economy, so it's all getting worse.
We're in an economic doom loop, aren't we? And this is exactly what we tried to get out of in 2022. We could see the way things were going, that we were already in a negative spiral. What Labour have done is basically put an accelerator on that.
That's right. Labour has managed to do the reverse of what you tried to do. So you tried to get the economy going by cutting taxes, and were waiting to cut expenditure at a later stage. Labour, instead of cutting taxes to boost the economy, is simply increasing expenditure with no plan or idea of how to achieve growth.
We also tried to do supply side. So we tried to get Britain fracking, which you were in charge of, Jacob. And one of the big things holding the British economy back now is just how high our energy prices are.
No, you're absolutely right. If you look at US and UK GDP per capita, you know this because your Growth Commission has focused on it. We were 90% of US GDP per capita in 2000. We're now 60%. And the biggest single difference between the US and UK economy over that period is energy prices.
But the other thing that I think has been a major factor in why the British economy has been such a failure for the last 30 years is monetary policy. And what we've seen is the printing of money, quantitative easing, we've seen pretty appalling interest rate policy pursued by the Bank of England. What sort of factor do you think that is?
Well, I think there's a lot of history in this and what has worked and what hasn't worked. And people think about what happened in Germany, what happened with Greenspan, and then have tried to apply it to the UK ineffectively. So go back to Germany. The Deutschmark, up until the point it joined the euro, was incredibly strong. Why? Because of the Bundesbank. Why was the Bundesbank so strong? Because of the Weimar Republic and the Weimar inflation. What was the Bundesbank's one job? Was to stop inflation. It did it very successfully, and the pound fell steadily against the Deutschmark over this period because the Bundesbank was very well run and was run by extremely clever people, but it had been given a constitutional objective of holding prices steady to avoid the Weimar experience. Then you had Greenspan in America, and Greenspan's very interesting because I think he's an absolutely disastrous chairman of the Federal Reserve because he uses monetary policy to stop markets moving in what he views as the wrong direction. And he tweaks monetary policy to flood the market with cash when he thinks the market is weak and take cash out when he thinks it's too strong. Now, that's not what the chairman of a Federal Reserve should be doing. But he did it for a time quite successfully, and he's retired by the crash of 2008. But that's very much the Greenspan crash. He does it for years. He goes on year after year after year. And people have looked at that and thought, well, the American economy has done well, and the German economy has done well. What have they got in common? Independent-ish central banks, very independent. In Germany's case, less so in the US and the Federal Reserve. Gordon Brown then copies that, thinking that that will work in a UK experience. And it doesn't. First of all, they don't actually have a monetary policy. They set interest rates, but they're not looking at monetary aggregates. The Monetary Policy Committee almost never makes any reference to the monetary aggregates, as in the medium-term financial strategy of Howe and Lawson. That's not what they're interested in. They get focused on inflation targeting, but they don't realize that monetary actions can have long-term effects. So quantitative easing takes place, and they do absolutely nothing to roll it back.
They decide to make it happen.
Yes.
They do exercise monetary policy. They just don't have a monetary target. They abandoned the monetary target in the 1990s.
And they don't look at anything that relates to monetary policy. They're just looking at inflation. They were just looking at inflation targeting. Were they achieving that? So when you flood, or when they flooded the market in 2008, all they were concerned about was inflation, without realizing that putting hundreds of billions of pounds into the economy would have long-term inflationary consequences. So they then do nothing to reverse it until too late, really, until you get to COVID, when they put more money into circulation, which is a terrible mistake, because although in 2008 you've got a credit crisis and a lack of available cash, when you get to COVID, you've got a supply crisis, that simply the supply chains break down. So printing more money is bound to be inflationary. And that's
What did Milton Friedman say?
what did Milton Friedman say? So in many ways, the
Inflation is
always and everywhere.
a monetary phenomenon, and he was right.
And Andy Haldane, the chief economist at the Bank of England, points this out to them. He says this is inflationary, so what do? They ease him out. So they had somebody in a role there to warn them, did his job very well, and it's against the groupthink, it's against the consensus, so he has to leave the Bank of England. He should, in fact, have been governor of the Bank of England.
Well, that's a matter of opinion, Jacob.
Okay. He'd have done it better than dear old Bailey.
The current governor is particularly bad, but of course we had Mark Carney before that, who's now busy ruining Canada as the governor of the Bank of England. But I agree with you completely about the failings of monetary policy, the fact that the bank abandoned monetarism in the late 80s, early 90s. They abandoned monetarism. They basically got taken over by Keynesianism, but there was never any public discussion about it. This happened behind closed doors. The policy was altered. They were made unaccountable by Gordon Brown, and certainly what I discovered as Prime Minister was the Bank of England governor had more power, certainly when I didn't necessarily have the entire Conservative Party behind me, but they had more power than the elected Prime Minister of the day. And that was a system created by Blair and Brown.
Yes, throughout my political career, I've always been trying to work out where power is. When I got into the House of Commons, I wondered if it was there. When I became a minister, I wondered if it was in ministerial office. When you became Prime Minister, I wondered if the Prime Minister had the power, and indeed Boris as well. And the closer I got to where I thought power was, the more it seemed to be somewhere else. And I think, unfortunately, power is not exercised by people who are democratically accountable, but we have set up systems, going right back to the early 90s, that give power to...
You say we?
Don't
you mean Tony Blair?
No, I don't, unfortunately. Some of the arm's length body activity starts late Thatcher Major period. This decision that decisions should be taken from politicians because they're erratic, they make decisions for political reasons, and give it to experts. So it certainly begins to start with Major.
It starts in 1854.
Oh, with Northcote Trevelyan. Not really. I mean, a word in defence of Northcote Trevelyan. Northcote Trevelyan.
We are going to come to blows.
Well,
just tell them, Jacob.
I've got to have a soft spot for Northcote Trevelyan because my sister-in-law's a descendant of Strafford Northcote. So I've always...
This is no excuse to justifying the
familial prejudice. Northcote Trevelyan was trying to solve a different problem. What it was trying to do was to stop jobbery and patronage being used to put completely incompetent people into jobs because they were related to the minister. And that's why you bring in an exam in civil service.
Don't you think that the cure was worse than the disease? Because that is ultimately the philosophy of saying elected politicians can't be trusted to appoint people. We need these independent people who are... And that what has happened is the left have, over time, been able to capture these people.
Yes, but the politicians have arranged this. So rather than blaming the individual civil servants...
No, I mainly blame Tony Blair. I mean, I think he's the biggest
I agree with that. He took it much further than we had. But I would blame Parliament, because Parliament handed over all of its powers. It handed over power to the European Union in the 1972 European Communities Act. So that starts the rot. There are lots of decisions the Parliament can't take. It hands over power in the Bank of England Act post-1997 to the Governor of the Bank of England. It hands over power to the Climate Change Committee in the Climate Change Act. You've then got the Human Rights Act that gives the judges much more power. It then sets up the Supreme Court that gives the judges more power. Everything since 1972.
It's a budget responsibility.
Oh, yeah.
A particular bête noire of mine.
Well, it's right to be, because...
Bête noire of Rachel Reeves.
Indeed, of course it is. And because Gordon Brown handed away monetary policy and George Osborne then handed away fiscal policy to people who are utterly unaccountable debaters. Also, they're wrong. They're not any good. If they were...
They're Keynesians. And they've adopted the same economic philosophy as people like Alan Greenspan, but of the Davos globalist mindset. Pro-net zero, pro-DEI, pro-mass migration, pro-printing money. And it was never... one of the frustrations I have is this was never overtly discussed.
No, you're quite right.
It was in the background, and frankly, a lot of MPs in the House of Commons don't even understand basic economics. It's never been discussed. We only had to get an ABR forecast, I believe it was once a year, and we knew that it would be a bad thing to get an ABR forecast because they are fundamentally not of our way of thinking. They believe in Keynesian economics. They believe that government spending is good and that supply-side economics, what George Bush described as voodoo economics, is bad and dangerous. So we worked on what was a plan, essentially from economic first principles to revive the British economy. I remember you put forward the idea of a flat tax, which I absolutely love, but we decided it was too much too soon.
I think I'm the only person who suggested an idea that was too radical even for you. But I thought...
It's not ever too radical, Jacob. It was just, given the constraints we were operating in the time, we had to calibrate what we were doing.
Crucially, I thought it was affordable. Because I thought you could... I'm a great believer in the Ronald Reagan principle that you have low tax rates and very few write-offs or exclusions. I thought if you removed pension write-offs and pension contribution benefits, you could pay for a flat tax of 20%. And actually, there were one or two other things you could have done, one or two other exemptions you could have taken away that would have meant you had more money coming in on the Treasury ready reckoners than you currently do. So it would have been deficit reducing rather than adding to the deficit. And you could have made corporation tax, income tax, and capital gains tax all at 20%.
What I want to do is explain to people really what happened at the time and how we were blindsided by the actions, particularly of the Bank of England.
I think one thing always to bear in mind is the role luck plays in politics, because the Bank of England was getting everything wrong at the time. The day before the
I
mini...
like the way you use the word everything wrong at the time. Like, they've got everything wrong for pretty much the last 20 years.
The Bank of England has subsequently admitted that 75% of the problem was caused by it, not by anything you did.
Well, that's correct, but even in the circumstances it did happen, where it was the day before the mini budget, isn't it extraordinary that I, as Prime Minister, was not briefed on what they were planning? To me, this just shows the whole system is completely ineffective, or more than ineffective, that the unelected think that they don't have any kind of duty to tell the elected what they're actually doing.
Also, I don't think the proper remit of Bank of England independence. The bank is independent on interest rates, but QE and QT was a joint policy between the Treasury and the Bank of England, because the Treasury had underwritten the losses that the Bank of England could have made and has subsequently made on the whole QE program. And therefore it needed the consent of the Treasury to carry on. So it's absolutely peculiar that the Treasury was not fully informed of this and had not accepted that they were about to enter QT.
But what I found, and I was a Treasury Minister back in 2017, is that the Treasury did not want to involve themselves in monetary policy. And they essentially said to me and to Philip Hammond, who was the then Chancellor, that we have an independent monetary policy. So the system, the Treasury officials, the Bank of England officials, the ABR officials, believes that these powers had been handed over. And I said, that's not true. The Treasury sets the remit for the Bank of England, such as the 2% inflation target. It's only right that this remit should be revisited. You know, it was set back in 1997. But they were so beholden to the whole concept of independence that they were very, very reluctant to challenge that taboo.
I think you're too nice to Treasury officials.
I've never been accused of that before.
But you're going to be. You're going to be, because I think they like to keep ministers out of it. In all the meetings,
That's definitely true.
But in all the meetings I had as a minister, the Treasury officials were the most arrogant. Actually, the whole of the Treasury building, it's really interesting. If you went in as a minister to the Cabinet Office, and indeed Bays, had the most delightful security teams. Always helpful, always polite, always doing their bit. If you went into the Treasury, you had the rudest, most difficult, jobs worth security. And I think it ran the whole way through. They thought that ministers in the Treasury were just a nuisance, a bore to be coped with. And I think it is a really rotten department.
But it essentially is the most powerful department in the government. And the Bank of England is essentially a wing, or closely allied with the Treasury. The officials travel between the Treasury and the Bank of England. Sometimes they pop off for a job at Goldman Sachs, but then they're back in either the Treasury or the Bank of England. And these are the most powerful people in the government. I have talked to many of my friends in the US, and they tell me the State Department is actually the most powerful part of the American deep state. But certainly it's the Treasury that is the tail wagging the dog of government. I completely agree with that. And that's why when I became Prime Minister, Kwasi and I decided to move Tom Scholar on, because he was really very much of that ideology, anti-Brexit, pro-mass migration, pro-net zero. And we recognised that all of these bodies were a problem, that the Bank of England was a problem, that the OBR was a problem, and the Treasury itself was a problem. but we had limited time and wherewithal to be able to deal with it in its entirety. And I certainly believe that these people were not on my side. And, we were fighting against a system that did not believe in supply side policies, that were believers in the Keynesian orthodoxy, and they were going to do everything they could to try and succeed it. And when there were, problems in the markets, which, as you rightly say, the Bank of England admitted was their fault. They admitted that in 2024, though, long after I was gone. But when there were problems in the markets, there was leaking and briefing 24/7 coming from Treasury officials, Bank of England officials, the OBR themselves, who claimed there was a £70 billion black hole. Now we know from Rachel Reeves, these black holes sort of constantly appear and disappear, but they were claiming that. And what I'm saying is, when we put together the mini budget, which in my view, I still believe was an absolute sensible package of policies, and we would be in a very different position had it been implemented, we were not given any insight at all into the QT program, into the problem with LDIs. I don't know if you want to explain a bit about the LDIs, Jacob, as a financial markets expert.
Well, again, the LDI problem is a much deeper one than this, because you had the pension fund regulator telling funds that they had to buy gilts. So you kept the value of gilts down. You were making companies put more money into their pension funds to make up for the deficit. You had very low interest rates. Very low interest rates had two effects on pension funds. One was, when you discounted back their liabilities came out to be very high. And the other was that the pension funds were making very low returns. So it was very difficult for them to make ends meet. So the pension funds, under instruction really from the regulator, got into LDIs, which allowed them to borrow to gear up their performance. Then interest rates start going up, and these borrowings become expensive. The returns are fixed because they're in gilts, so pension funds had a gap.
How much do you think this was deliberate sabotage? And how much do you think it was they had cocked up in a major way and were seeking to shift the blame?
I never think the British state is clever enough to run a conspiracy, but that you have people with similar vested interests who are working in the same way. And you got rid of Tom Scholar, therefore you would upset all their mates. So they were right.
We would never have got the mini budget through if Tom Scholar
No.
there. This was the problem.
I'm
So you're kind of damned if you do.
I'm not blaming you for the decision, but the decision meant that all his friends in high places, the Andrew Baileys of this world, were not sympathetic because they all like Tom. Tom, I don't know him actually, but I understand he's very personable, got a very strong network, and that network inevitably, on personal grounds, was unsympathetic to what was being done. They felt he was...
I don't think they were sympathetic in the first place, because during the leadership election, I'd gone on record saying that Britain's monetary policy hadn't worked, that the Bank of England had failed on inflation,
which was
that the
obviously true,
had got every single forecast wrong. But, you're kind of caught in this situation in politics of, if you were honest about how bad things are, you create a whole bunch of enemies who are part of the current system who then want to destroy you. Well, thank you very much, Jacob.
Always a pleasure.
Coming on the show. Thank you for serving in my cabinet, however briefly it was. It's appointing me. And let's hope we have an opportunity to reshape Britain again. You've heard from Jacob and Andrew about what really happened in 2022. And it's not the narrative that you'll see in the mainstream media or repeated by the political class. The evidence is clear. The market crisis in 2022 was caused by the Bank of England. And the flames were fanned by people in the Conservative Party and the mainstream media who wanted me out of office. They continue to repeat this false narrative to this day. And I think it's a huge problem for our country. We can't have an honest discussion about the institutional failure that's happened in Britain and the results which have led us to stagnation and national decline. So my message to the authors of the Coup of 22 is, you're on borrowed time. The truth will out.